Hello and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, which is brought to you by sharedserviceslink.com. It's our first webinar of 2013, so wishing you all a very happy new year. So today we are looking at how to drive continuous improvement within shared services beyond solely managing by KPIs. I'm very pleased to say our sponsor for today is Consider Solutions. So let's have a look at our presenters. Many of you are familiar with me. My name is Susie West and I'm the founder and CEO at sharedserviceslink.com, a company that's was established in 2007 and is a community for leaders in shared services. And we are very pleased to say that we have a membership of 11,000 members globally and growing. And today I'm introducing as our main presenter Dan French, who is the founder and CEO of Consider Solutions, an organization that was set up in 2003. And Dan is our expert for today's session. As you know, you have a very important role to play in the next hour, and that is to ensure that you submit your question that compelled you to come and register for this webinar, and submit that question to me nice and early, please, and I will put that to Dan in the last 10 minutes of this session. So I think you're familiar with how it all works, but if not, it's highlighted in the red box there. You just need to submit your question in that text box and post it to me, and I will put it to Dan. So let's have a look at why we're actually having this discussion today. It's proved to be a very, very popular webinar, and I think one primary reason for that is the shared services concept has been around really now for 20 years. The pioneers were really getting their teeth into it in the early 1990s. And what we're seeing now is that shared services as a concept, it's very much established, and there's a large number of mature shared services organizations out there who are now deeply in the throes of continuous improvement activities. And it's largely believed that within this life cycle, though it's to be applied right across the life cycle of shared services, but within this phase of continuous improvement within the shared services life cycle, metrics are absolutely critical to those improvements, and sometimes incremental improvements that are realized. So metrics are vital, the gathering of them and understanding which ones to gather. But what we're going to be discussing here is how effectively are they being used within an organization. Many of us lean on key performance indicators and a particular set of key performance indicators, and this session is really challenging the sensibilities behind that. So with all that in mind, I'm very pleased to introduce Dan French, who's the CEO and founder at Consider Solutions. So over to you, please, Dan.
Thank you, Susie. Hello, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. As Susie says, this session is focused on driving continuous improvement in shared services beyond just using KPIs, and I'm going to explain why that is critical. So there are some questions that may have piqued your interest when you signed up for this webcast. We know shared services are maturing, both in principle and practice. We know that continuous improvement is now the priority for many. But the questions that hopefully got you thinking are here. So do your key performance indicators in your shared services organization really drive continuous improvement? And since standardization and simplification are so key, how do you know how standardized your processes really are in practice? And in terms of deviation from the norm, deviation from the standard, to what degree does your current approach give you the detail on those issues and exceptions that need to be improved to hit the target results? And what sort of information do you use? And where do you identify where the effort in the shared services organization and even back into the business is being wasted and you're driving or you're leaking cash? So those are the questions that got us here. Today's discussion, we've had the introductions. I'm going to talk a little bit about this concept of a third wave in shared services, which I think is gathering a lot of support, and really look at the whole issue of standardization and simplification and its role in the whole world-class finance concept within which shared services sits. We're going to look at continuous improvement and key performance indicators. I'm going to look at something very specific in exception monitoring and what we like to call key exception indicators. And as we go through, you'll realize why this is important. As part of that, I'm going to share some examples, and we're going to engage you in a few polls to ensure you're awake during the whole session and make sure you're paying attention. So I'm going to hand over to Susie now for the first poll.
Thank you very much indeed, Dan. So coming up on your screen now, first poll out of a number, as Dan mentioned there. Where are you in your shared services journey today? Are you evaluating and or designing shared services? Are you setting up shared services? Are you post go live and more in the stabilization of your shared services organization? Are you in the continuous improvement phase? Or perhaps you are as far as you can go in the shared services journey, what some might term as the shared services nirvana. So we like to get a response rate up to 70%, please. We're currently at 65%. So if you haven't responded, please do so. We do always share the results, so it's very, very good for benchmarking. Closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. We were at 79%. Let's see if we can beat that next time. Thank you very much. Coming up on your screen now. You can see, actually, very interestingly, and this is very encouraging, and I'm sure it's got a lot to do with the theme of today's webinar. We have 62% of you within the continuous improvement phase, and congratulations to the 2% of you that are in the nirvana stage. Interesting results there. Back to you, please, Dan.
Okay, thank you, Susie. I think those of you in nirvana are probably attending this webcast because you've got so little to do now. So you just thought you'd listen to what other people are doing. But that's very interesting. It's good to see that so many people in the continuous improvement phase. So let's look at shared services as the status today. The shared services achievement is substantial. I think the foundation's been built in terms of centralization, common systems, and a level of standardization. And the results, if you look at the results of what we've got out of these first waves, yes, we've driven financial savings. Perhaps not all of the financial savings we expected at the outset, and that again plays into why continuous improvement is so important. We're getting predictability in results, which is good. I think one of the unexpected outcomes, a positive outcome, is the fact that most of us have found the whole compliance regime has actually come at less effort as a result of shared services. By centralizing and standardizing the compliance activities and achieving compliance has been easier, so that's been a good thing. And of course now we've got organizations with a mission, real shared services organizations who are really extending beyond the original idea of just accounting shared services to broader business services. Now I'd like to look at a benchmark, and there's some very interesting benchmarks around. I'm sure you subscribe to many of them. This one's AQPC, cost of general accounting per $1,000 of revenue. And what's fascinating about this is the sheer range of performance across from top performance down to the bottom performance in terms of, I mean, dramatic orders of magnitude shift. But what's even more interesting is it's just as wide amongst shared services practitioners as it is for those in the traditional model. And that raises the question, why is that? And that's kind of the issue we're trying to address today and in the work we're doing around this. Because it's clear that shared services alone, even with some standardization and centralization, doesn't actually drive to upper quartile results. So we look at this concept of a third wave, that, where we're all going to. The business demands are clearly, we want more for less. There's still a drive to reduce cost. But there's a growing call to increase the business value as well, the real getting deeper into the business. And so it's not just about cost, but nobody's going to admit that they don't want you to cut the costs further. The business value is really, there's bigger issues about strategic flexibility, ability to enter new markets, and the rest of it. But the process responses we are seeing is obviously to drive customer satisfaction and business value. There's a big discussion and focus on better business partnering. But the really driving the cost efficiencies is about enhancing the simplification and standardization, because we clearly haven't got as far as we need to go, and that's got to be done through continuous improvement. So we're seeing a lot of comment that the way to do that is going to be through better data analytics. But what kind of data analytics specifically? Because we're not talking about the same approach that we've used for customer or sales trending in the sales and marketing parts of our business. So, it's an interesting concept. But let's think about simplification and standardization as the central plank of shared services. That's what it's all about. Now, the fact we're focusing on simplification and standardization, we'd like to think, therefore, it's going to be simple. But sadly, there's a paradox here that's slightly complex. So I've got a parallel here to show you. The top left is a wonderful vehicle I had the pleasure of seeing and even going in Manila last year, which is called a jeepney, and it's a mass transit vehicle. And they're all very, very personalized and painted and set up by the owners and drivers. They're highly customized, highly personalized. And the good thing about it, one of the few good things about it, is the driver can fix it. When that thing goes wrong, he can get out, get under the hood, and fix anything. It's a scary event to actually go on one, but just looking at it is okay. You compare that to a contemporary car, which is made by one of our clients. It's very standardized, but there's a lot of complexity under the hood. And as a driver, you don't have access to the detail to fix anything that goes wrong. Now, it's interesting to think about that. It's exactly the same issue with processes and systems in simplification and standardization. What might appear simple on the outside, like the BMW down there, actually hides a lot of complexity. And it's difficult sometimes to understand exactly how these things are working. So we need to think about that parallel and what it means in our processes and systems. So let me make an assertion. This is the paradox of complexity. Part of the standardization drive is we use our new common finance or ERP system to drive the standardization. And we spend a lot of money on this to drive process standardization, efficiencies, and economies of scale. I think the elephant in the room, though, is that actually, when we implement these systems, we're not actually implementing a standard business process. We're implementing a standard data input process. And there's a very big difference. And this is the root of some of the issues we're seeing in the lack of standardization in practice. So if you're having trouble believing that, let's go through to an example. So let's say it's a very, very simple accounting situation that reflects kind of a three-way match: receiving delivery, matching against a purchase order, and accepting a delivery so you can accept an invoice and pay it. So it's very easy these days with the systems we have to configure. We have our systems providers configure our systems to make sure you cannot enter a goods receipt or a shipment if there's no purchase order. So that's easy to do. So you consider this specific sequence in this organization. A truck drops off a shipment. There's no purchase order for it, or perhaps it's an invoice delivered into the finance function, and there's no purchase order for that. And in this case, warehouse calls up purchasing, so well, we need to create a purchase order because I can't do anything with this. I'm in purchasing, then we'll create a purchase order, get the approval, and then the goods receipt can be created against the PO and the business process can continue. Now, the system is perfectly happy with that because everything's happened in the right sequence. But as a process, it's a mess. And there's a load of side impacts of that, not least that your cash flow forecasting is of limited value if you're only actually recording planned purchases when stuff gets delivered. The flip side is also, we've seen this in many organizations where there's a whole load of other process issues, like how does the pricing for this thing get set? And we sometimes find very weird situations where the pricing is actually being set by the delivery note that came with the goods or service. So the only good thing here is the first-time match KPI works very well, although there's a process breakdown. But if you think about this, we like to believe our ERP, our finance systems are going to allow a standard set of controls, standard set of workflows, which are going to make sure the process works the way it's meant to. But it doesn't necessarily, and this is a critical point. So we need to bear that in mind and think about those kind of exceptions as we move on. And of course, this particular example is an example of a process exception, which you don't really want to happen. So the essence of the challenge is we know what should happen in our processes, but we need to be able to identify what actually does happen and understand the delta. And with that delta, we need to work out whether processes are being ignored or the policies aren't well understood or something else is getting in the way. What we tend to find is there's a much bigger delta than we would like to believe when you actually look at the detail of these process executions. So there's bigger exceptions, but the interesting point is often these deviations are there not through any malice or forethought. it's because those folks actually doing the job, to achieve their performance targets, they have to do things in a slightly more quick, faster way. And as you get into these, you find there's quite often very good reasons for this. So, for example, the previous sequence there about creating purchase orders when a delivery arrived, when we actually got to the root of that, in a particular organization we were looking at, the feeling was in the factory, in the industrial plants, was that the pricing for some of the raw materials was so volatile, they had trouble creating purchase orders for it, so they worked that this was a better way of doing it. Now, obviously, still not good, but they worked a way around it, but only when they found the exceptions actually existed. So we need to know the difference in what should happen and what does happen. So let's look at an example. So invoice processing, classic case, you have a purchase order to initiate and approve a purchase, and you want to have pretty much touchless invoicing and payment approval on a match. So you get a very high first-time match rate, you drive the invoice processing cost and effort down, and also, as a byproduct, you're going to get on-time payments, so you're going to get any discounts you're eligible for, and you're going to get good supplier relationships. So that's fine, but what can go wrong? And this is where we start thinking about what are the exceptions to our key processes and exceptions that might be a byproduct of our key performance indicators. And in this particular example, well, what can go wrong here was duplicate invoices and things that cause duplicate invoices, such as duplicate vendors and duplicate POs. Now, we found in this instance 3% of their invoices were duplicate, which obviously has a big cash impact, particularly if you're going to pay them. Now, 3% doesn't sound like a massive percentage, but if you think about the impact of the cost of the process is magnified 10x at least in diagnosis, remedial action, and recovery, then it starts to become significant, and you don't want to have duplicates for all the reasons we know. So in this case, we established there was duplicate vendor data, there was non-purchase order, non-PO orders, and some imprecise PO data. So it allowed us to focus on the root cause, fix those things, and drive that out. Now, the funny thing about duplicate invoices and duplicate payments, it's just a sort of side story, there's a strange trend in our own organization that when our clients move to a new shared service center, we have a pretty high rate of seeing duplicate payments coming our way. So it's kind of quite interesting given the business we're in. So usually because the processes of getting bedded in don't work quite the way they should to start with. So just the process of implementing a shared service center doesn't necessarily give us the result we want. So let's have a look at this whole concept of world-class finance. The idea of shared services is a strategy for world-class finance. It's a way of achieving these big goals. Obviously, we're all focused on driving the business results, the top and bottom line we need. As part of that, the leading organizations are driving the cost of finance down towards 0.5% of revenue, and that's down from 2 or 3% in a couple of years back. Obviously, we want to optimize cash flow, and certainly not by paying people twice, and a more proactive approach to risk management. So when you look at some of the impact of the surveys and research being done on this, some very good data now from Hackett and others, which I'm sure many of you subscribe to. But the key thing we're seeing with this getting to the top, getting to that 0.5% of revenue cost of finance, is some of the key things are, yes, shared services are key in driving results, but better decision support is required to optimize those results and to optimize the processes. And again, you see here decision support, analytical activities. And again, this is coming down towards data analytics, but we have to ask the question, what kind of data analytics are going to help us? So let's have a look at another view of that, which I actually prefer. This is a nice kind of jigsaw view of the pillars of success in world-class finance. It's a nice way of representing the efficiency and effectiveness goals and what that's all about, and then relevance and influence. And what I like about this is the relevance piece, providing analytical support that decision makers need, is what drives efficiency and effectiveness. That is really the, if you like, the leading indicator of success in the others. And we're going to talk a little bit about leading indicators shortly. So I think that's an important way of building the result, building the foundation of better efficiency, better effectiveness. We need to be able to have better support. So there's some really, again, some good statistics which show in terms of the cost of finance, we're driving down towards 0.5% of revenue for total cost. But what's really interesting is a substantial shift in the percentage of the new number, 0.5%, let's say, a very significant increase into the percentage of that effort, which is in decision support and control and reporting. Now, as we drive transaction processing costs down, it's these better analytical control decision support efforts that allow us to drive transaction costs even further. So that's an interesting point in that we have to invest in doing that right to drive the cost down in the transaction processing. So we've got another poll here, Susie.
Thank you very much indeed, Dan. It's coming up on your screen now. Second poll of the day. What is your current model for processing finance transactions? Please just tick one box. Do you operate in-house in your pre-shared services, and maybe you're centralized but not really a shared services organization, or maybe you're decentralized? Are you in-house captive shared services? Are you mainly outsourced, or are you what you would classify as a captive and outsourced blend? Or maybe none of the above apply, in which case tick other. We're at 68% of you responding. If you haven't already done so, please do tick the box most appropriate to your own situation, closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much for that. We were at 86% of you responding, so that's very nice and high. So coming up on your screen now, really interesting results actually, with 54% of you saying that you operate an in-house captive shared services, and you can see 15% of you say mainly outsourced, and you can see the rest of the results there. But interesting that over half of you operate an in-house captive shared services. Interesting results. Back to you, please, Dan.
That's very, very interesting, yes. The reason that poll is there is there's some discussion, I'm sure it happens in your own organizations, about if you do have any outsourced shared services, who owns the responsibility for continuous improvement? Is the continuous improvement owned by the host organization, or should the outsourcer drive that as part of their contract? And there's some interesting discussions there, and interesting to see with some of you folks what your approach to that for those who do outsourcing. So one of the insights we've kind of come up with is looking at performance optimization. We've kind of realized that there's a couple of big things, as we know. There's driving business results, business performance, but there's also proactively managing risks that impact our financial processes. And if you like, the barriers, the bad things that happen that get in the way of achieving a business result are quite often similar things to the things that cause risks to be exposed. So we like to think about what are the things that can go wrong, what are those barriers, and we need to find them, diagnose them, and remove them. And that focus helps drive improvement activities. So that gearbox idea is is a kind of helpful thing to think about. Okay, this cog for bad things, it could actually be risk-related or it could be performance-related. And that leads us into thinking about KPIs. We can't live with them, we can't live without them. But if you think about KPIs, most KPIs used for measuring performance are lagging indicators. They're after the fact. They tell you how stuff happened in the last week, the last month, the last quarter. But generally, if you're trying to fix things, if you're trying to improve things, you need leading indicators, things that you get early. You can actually fix stuff before the results have gone south. So, we're starting to see now that, when we start talking about exceptions, which we'll be talking about, and these barriers, these really are examples of leading indicators before the fact, or certainly before the results have been achieved. So let's look at an example here. So think about, let's think about accounts receivable. And in accounts receivable, if you think about accounts receivable from a risk point of view, what's the risk in accounts receivable? The risk in accounts receivable is that we don't get paid. So we want to make sure we do get paid. And so we put in place all sorts of controls and risk mitigation around credit checking of customers, make sure they're going to be capable of paying, payment terms that are short enough that they're likely to agree to pay them, and validating delivery quantity and quality. So that's kind of a risk and control way of looking at it. But if you look at what's the performance measure for accounts receivable, it's usually days sales outstanding, DSO. Now that's a classic KPI. So if your DSO is 40 or 41 and you keep that on your dashboard and it's looking green, it's 41, the only time you know you've got a problem is when it goes to 42 or 43 or worse. So the lights go red, there's a panic, everyone's running around trying to work out what's happened to our collections, that our DSO is going down. Now what we've discovered by applying some of these techniques is we've realized the things that impact DSO are very likely to be the same kind of barriers that affect the risks we worried about to start with. So quite often these two things are two sides of the same coin. And we're going to see some of these examples, and as we talk through examples it will become obvious. But it's kind of interesting that key performance indicators, when they're lagging measures, they're not very helpful to drive action. They're nice to be able to say how well we're doing, but they're not good to drive action. So you need something like these barriers, these exceptions. If we can look at those early, we've got a better chance of dealing with things. Now, the other thing that's kind of fascinating about that is managing by KPI too much can drive suboptimal results, can be counterproductive. And we've all got experience of this, we all know that. I mean, a classic case we all know is call centers. Certainly a few years ago, there was a big drive to accelerate issue resolution, so management in call centers put in a target of calls that last no longer than 120 seconds. And then we found to meet the KPI, operators were deliberately killing calls even if the customer had the phone back. So, and that's, because of the lagging indicators issue, quite often they're not great for driving performance improvement. So this visual here you're looking at, I'm wondering what's that there. This is a classic image for me that illustrates the whole issue about exceptions and barriers. And in this case, it really is a barrier. It's a car park barrier in the middle of your screen. So this is the entrance to a client car park in southern Germany. They have this lovely little barrier, which is a control over the expected process. And you drive up, you swipe your ID card, it recognizes you, opens the barrier, you go through, park your car. At the end of the day, do the same thing again, and you're out of the car park, and it knows your car is no longer their responsibility. And better still, we have a little guy who comes along every 3 months, and he checks the barrier, he knows it works, it's going up and down at the right place, it's perfectly sorted out, and he gets it signed off, so they're very happy. And only in wintertime in the snow do you see what's really happening. And the exceptions here are people drive the tire tracks through the snow. And we need this is a very visceral image to remember. We need to track what's really going on, the tire tracks in our business processes, rather than just rely on the expected process and the control around it. And that image has lasts me well, and I use it in a lot of discussions. So what is an exception? So it's a mismatch between expected and actual performance. If we can do it early, it's typically a kind of leading indicator of success. It can either be things that shouldn't happen but do, multi-touch invoices, duplicated effort, duplicate payments we talked about, and things that should happen but don't. So three-way match, credit checking, supplier discount claim, and so on. And they can happen on purpose or by accident, and obviously when you think of on purpose you might think, well, that's about fraud. Well, not really, although that's one small area of, an area of concern. Usually when these things happen on purpose, it's because there's either ignorance around the purpose of the real process, there's a system or process flaw which doesn't really support the activities of the teams, and perhaps history was a certain way it was done in a certain part of the organization. So these exceptions typically happen in a good organization. They happen in single-digit percentage points, but they have a massive impact on, a big effect on the effort and efficiency of the process, because when you're trying to resolve those things after the fact, it takes a lot more time than doing them right the first time. Added to which, by looking at them, they turn up continuously. So by looking at those in those ways, you can drive improvement on an ongoing basis. And interestingly, they're often influenced by the KPIs themselves. So if we look at improvement by exception, if you look at this as a process, you've got to look at the key processes and KPIs you have, which are all good. We need KPIs. But we need to also we need to define what can go wrong, these key exception indicators. We need to identify those exceptions from the standard up to whatever tolerances we think are appropriate. We need to decide to focus on the low-hanging fruit, certainly to start with. So you need to work out what tolerances you care about. Identify the root causes, manage and resolve those issues, and then use that as continuous improvement. The interesting thing is, by taking this approach, it's a non-disruptive approach to driving performance improvement. It's rapid to execute, it's rapid return. If you think about most of the strategies we have for improvement, they require a big change in either processes, people, or systems. You know, structural change to systems, to controls, to the process itself. By monitoring exceptions, this can be done in a light touch way without actually impacting the daily work, except where you want to drive the continuous improvement. So we have another poll now, Susie.
Thank you very much indeed, Dan. Again, coming up on your screen. Is your shared services organization monitoring business exceptions at a transactional level to drive improvement in core processes? Please tick one of the following, please. Yes, to a large extent. Yes, to some extent. Not really. Other parts of the organization are largely responsible for this. Not really applicable to our company, or maybe you don't know the answer. So please tick the box most appropriate to you. Is your shared services organization monitoring business exceptions at a transactional level to drive improvement in core processes? And you can see the response choice there. So we've got 74% of you responding. If you haven't done so, please do so. I will be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. We were 81% response rate, so thank you for that. Coming up on your screen, again, nice, interesting results coming up. You can see 60% of you said that you are, to some extent, monitoring business exceptions at a transactional level to drive improvement in core processes. So 60% of you are, to some extent, only 13% to a large extent. So another interesting set of results there. Back to you, please, Dan.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I guess what this might give you is some ideas of a systematic way to drive that more broadly in your organization. But it's good that so many people are looking at exceptions in an organization, and perhaps it'll give you some ideas of a broader way of applying it. So let's think of another example, purchase order processing. Now, obviously, a typical process is you have a purchase request, a PR to approve expenditure, and a purchase order to initiate and approve purchases, and you have some key performance indicators, which might be the spend under purchase order, so you want to maximize the spend under purchase order, might be PO processing cost. But what can go wrong is clearly multi-touch, anything that drives wasted effort. So multi-touch purchase orders and changes to PO pricing and terms is something we've seen considerably. And in this particular example, we saw a massive 11% of purchase orders in this particular organization were undergoing change activity, which made no sense until we started to diagnose a root cause, where we realized that there was pro forma purchase orders being used, or purchase orders being set up with insufficient information, because the way the process worked, people didn't have all of the information they needed to produce an effective, complete purchase order. There was also some issues with master data inaccuracy. But identifying these things, we had for a very large amount of activity where the organization was going through repeated activities on the same purchase orders, human activity, updating, changing stuff, which also brings in a whole new opportunity for error. So that was kind of very interesting, and to drive that whole PO change right down to a much more insignificant level. That was the kind of focus there. So when we look at process improvement, we start to see these cycles, looking at process, KPI, what's the exceptions. When you look at the classic continuous improvement cycles, I mean, however you do it, you know, usually they kind of in this kind of cycle, whether it's Six Sigma or just, you know, a general quality improvement approach, you define your processes, you define your performance indicators, you measure your performance against them, you analyze the results, you improve the processes, you implement some control to make sure it actually happens, and you go around this beautiful loop. And in the work we've been doing and conversations we've been having, it's become clear that whilst everybody agrees and uses a similar cycle, there's kind of a miracle occurs inspiration that happens between measure and analyze, because the performance indicators aren't really enough to analyze deviation, and the causes of deviation. So that's been kind of quite a big insight for people. And so it raises questions about measures and key performance indicators. So you can't go through a presentation like this without a little bit of Dilbert or Dogbert and his manager. This is an observation on indicators, which I think, with a wry smile, many of us have seen. So the Dogbert is saying, so you need, the manager, you need a dashboard application to track your key metrics. So you're going to have more data to ignore when you make your decisions based purely on company politics. And the manager says, well, will the data be accurate? He says, well, let's pretend that matters. And it comes back to this whole issue of KPIs. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but there's a very specific example here I'm going to share. Again, a real example which, based on looking at exceptions, you see what's going on. This is about cash collections and day sales outstanding. So the process around sales invoicing and accounts receivable. The big focus here was day sales outstanding number. And this organization had an apparently great collections record. I mean, almost world-beatingly unbelievable, which was already a bit of an interesting thing. So by looking at exceptions, what we discovered was there was a delay. The delay between sales order and delivery and invoice was a critical piece, because the DSO KPI was measured from the clock started ticking when the invoice got raised to when payment happened. And what we found was that by finding these exceptions and working out what the root causes were, we're finding the AR teams were calling up the big customers and saying, okay, do you have what you need on the invoice, and when are we going to get it paid? And they say, yes, you're going to get paid in the next run in 2 weeks. And then it's, okay, now we'll issue you the invoice. And before that, it's a pro forma invoice, which didn't get registered on the KPI. So there's a lot of work going on. So we had this great cash collection metric, which is undermined by the use of a pro forma invoice, which didn't hit the KPI. And it was the whole reason they were doing this is they had lots of invoicing errors. So they were trying to find a way of addressing the problems of getting cash in the door when their invoices were in error. So these delays, so what we started to do is track what was an expected and appropriate delay from delivery to invoice, and saw some enormous gaps, which made this whole cash collections success rather less positive than it should have been. So when you put all this together, what we're saying and what we're seeing in terms of a systematic methodology for this, that just as is the big cycle we saw earlier, yes, you've got to define your process, you've got to have your performance measures, but it's a big piece in the middle, which is you've got to be able to have identified exceptions. What are the things that can go wrong? You've got to monitor for them, and then when you've diagnosed those exceptions, you get identified some root causes, you fix those, drive that into learning a good practice, and make that a part of the continuous improvement cycle. And it's only by having the what can go wrong piece in the middle, the identified exceptions, that drives that into a workable process. Without that, we have the miracle occurs problem. So another example, look to automate the process for payables, an automated touchless process. So they want an automated touchless process around invoices and goods receipt, and they want to reduce the cost per invoice. So what we looked at, what can go wrong here? Well, one of the things we found is there's an opportunity for overpayment. Once we have automated payment based on the three-way match automatically, well, then we had to look at, well, what can go wrong here? And in these systems and processes, there were tolerances built in, up to 5% and more in some cases. So in the automated match, the goods receipts, which were greater than purchase orders and invoices that were greater than goods receipts were being processed automatically for payment. And we found 44.5% overpayment in certain areas. Now that was pretty stunning because it's cash that shouldn't be going out of the organization. We certainly found in diagnosing root causes there were some vendors who seemed to have an awareness of this and had an enthusiasm with slightly over submitting their invoices and over delivering. There was an issue with the payment tolerances and these complex system controls which weren't very well understood. So again, by looking at what can go wrong in the touchless world, you've got to be very careful that the tolerances are right, and they're set in many different places, so we need to make sure they're actually driving the process we want. So let's have a look, Susie, at the fourth poll.
Thank you very much, Dan. Coming up on your screen. One tick only, please, for one of the options. So what function in the organization should own exception analytics for continuous improvement? So maybe they do already, or perhaps they should. Is it the CFO/controller, head of shared services? Is it the process owner or process improvement teams? Is it the area for risk management, or is there another area that should own this? So pretty interesting question here. What function in the organization should own exception analytics for continuous improvement? Please tick one of the options only. Is it the CFO/controller function? Is it the head of shared services, process owner or process improvement teams, risk management, or other? 75% of you have actually responded. If you haven't already done so, please do so. This is a particularly interesting area, a particularly interesting question. And I will be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Closing it now. 84% of you having responded, so thank you for that. So results coming up, and I'm pleased that only 2% of you ticked other. It'd be quite interesting to know what the other is. 12% of you CFO controller, 21% head of shared services, and 63% process owner or process improvement teams. And I suppose, and kind of the follow-up question there might be, where does the process owner or process improvement teams sit? Do they sit within the shared services organization, outside the shared services organization? So perhaps another discussion to be had there. But interesting results there, only 3% within risk management, but I think very compelling results there with the 21% and the 63%. Back to you, please, Dan. Right,
that's very, very interesting, and I think that reflects the experience and views we see elsewhere, the process ownership definitely being the majority. The interesting thing about process ownership, of course, is it quite often drives back into the business beyond just shared services. So sometimes these processes, all shared services processes drive back into business, into other areas of operation. So that's kind of very, very interesting. So let's look then at the exception analytics process. So the way of going about doing this, so some of you are doing this already, perhaps not in a systematic methodological way, perhaps you're doing it ad hoc reporting, but the approach that we kind of can be summarized as scoping out the process or the slice of the process that's most relevant to you for performance improvement and any organizational targets, because in global organizations there may be some slices across that, business units, product groups, or whatever. We want to work out and agree what are the performance themes or risk themes, if that's relevant, and agree ownership to manage and resolve exceptions, which comes back to what we just talked about with that poll. Who owns the managing and resolving and fixing the process? And then an ongoing analysis of all the relevant data, 100% of the transactions and data against those rules, so you get both the aggregate percentages and trends, but you get all of the detail of all of the exceptions that you can then aggregate into which are the root causes for each, with some diagnosis, and then some kind of workflow mechanism for addressing and resolving those, and use that to drive your process for continuous improvement. And the observation here is it's a very rapid execution, rapid return process. It's not structurally embedded in your current processes or systems. It's a monitoring mechanism. So thinking about the third wave of shared services as we come around the cycle here. We know that we've got to continue to drive process efficiency, speed, and quality. We know as an organization we've got to help to support world-class finance. We've got to deliver the expertise and business partnering and support, analytical support we need. And the evidence is exception analytics are a key tool in supporting those principles. It should be evolutionary and iterative. Don't try and do this everywhere, but build up a set of expertise using this kind of methodology in a particular process, perhaps a particular region to start with. And you want to start with some kind of assessment or benchmark so you can see how much variation you've got in the process, so you can work out and start working with the stakeholders to work out how you do this root cause analysis and how you drive the continuous improvement. And when you do that assessment, you want to think about a process slice typically. So again, rather than just saying, oh, we're going to do the whole of the purchase to pay process, you might say, we're going to do one slice. It might be a regional slice, and a part of the product, it might be a payable slice, for example. So we have one final poll, which is, again, relevant to this benchmarking piece. Susie?
Thank you, Dan. A multiple choice answer here, so please do tick all that apply. In which financial process areas do you see the biggest benefit of monitoring business exceptions? So which of the following can you see the benefit of monitoring business exceptions? Purchase to pay or accounts payable, record to report, stroke general ledger, order to cash, stroke accounts receivable, treasury function, or other. So multiple choice here, but really it's what we're asking for is the biggest benefit. So maybe with your multiple choice, maybe think about the two that would really be the areas, the process areas where you could see the biggest benefits. So only 67% of you have responded. So if you haven't already done so, please do tick the one or two boxes that resonate with you. And closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. We were at 79%, 81% of you responding. So thank you. Coming up on your screen now, let's have a look. So I think no real surprises in that purchase to pay stroke accounts payable is the clear winner, and order to cash stroke accounts receivable is coming in a strong second place. And then interestingly, it just drops considerably with 22% record to report and 14% treasury. Again, another set of interesting results. Back to you, please, Dan.
That's very interesting results, and it does support the other research we've done. The interesting piece about it, of course, is sometimes it's influenced by the fact that pretty much all shared services functions do accounts payable, but sometimes accounts receivable is a later add-in. So it could be either that we believe that accounts payable and purchase to pay is the biggest value area, or it's the biggest value area in the organizations we have where that is the primary purpose of the accounting transaction services. But anyway, very good stuff. Thank you. So we asked these questions at the beginning, and when you signed up for this, we've talked today about unanticipated consequences of KPIs. We've talked about leading and lagging indicators, measures and barriers. We've talked about a methodology, a systematic approach for identifying things that go wrong, the barriers, the exceptions, and an intelligent way of driving out where effort's being wasted and cash is being wasted, and an idea about how you benchmark for that to start the process and improve your way of working. So the basic thesis of this webcast was how to drive continuous improvement in shared services beyond solely managing by KPIs. And I would like to summarize this by saying I think there's 3 myths we've uncovered. One is the myth of standardization. Yes, we know it's important. It gives economy of scale. It leads to uniform data, but it doesn't automatically lead to standard process execution. There's a level of standardization beyond what we're going to get from systems we need to do. The measures myth, lagging KPIs, measures after the fact aren't enough to drive improvement action. Some of these indicators are one-dimensional, they drive unintended consequences, and it's the exceptions to our expectation or a process or a policy that exposes the real process. And the miracle piece, which is really about the systematic process, the methodology, we know and we're observing that analysis of these exceptions drives continuous improvement. We know continuous improvement is driving the charge to world-class finance and the operating goals we saw earlier. And certainly all the evidence is, take an approach of, an evolutionary approach of benchmarking, assessing a slice of a process by doing this exception analytics on that to work out where you stand relative to expectation. So with that, I'll say thank you. I think we've got time for some questions. If you do want to explore this topic further, there is a white paper that's behind today's presentation, which also includes some research. So you can send me an email to get that. If you're interested in reading musings on my blog, you can see that down there. And enjoy the journey to continuous improvement. Susie?
Thank you very much, Dan, and do take Dan up on that offer to receive the white paper. It's very, very good and really looks into the third wave principle, so well worth contacting him to get a copy of that. Let's move to questions. We have a number of questions that have come through. If you haven't already posted me your question, please do so now. So one question from a viewer, Dan, is regarding when developing a shared services organisation, what would you recommend as the leading KPIs to have in place from the off, and what areas would they be in?
Okay, that's a very good question. I think when the process you need to go to identify those leading indicators, which are basically the exception indicators, is you need to identify the process. So let's say everybody's doing payables in the shared services. So you've got to identify what are the performance indicators you have for payables, and then you've got to work out, and those performance indicators are all going to be about driving down the cost, improving the standardization of the result. So then you've got to think about, so what can go wrong in that? And a lot of the areas that go wrong are to do with multiple touch. So it's areas that cause multiple touch, but it's a process you want to go through as a group to talk through. It doesn't take a lot of time, but you want to talk through. These are the processes in our shared service center. These are the performance indicators. These are the likely big wins on exception indicators, and then you can prioritize which of those you want to look at first.
Okay, good, thank you. I mean, I know you've been through it, but a question that has come through is explain why KPIs essentially, so in a way that maybe people can take it to their team, if you were going to boil it down, why KPIs are not good for improvement. If you were going to kind of just come up with one sentence that people can go and take out to their team just to educate their team on why perhaps they shouldn't be using KPIs or shouldn't be using KPIs in a certain way, what would that one sentence be?
Well, first of all, you should certainly use KPIs, but bear in mind what they're there for. So KPIs for measuring results are not good for driving action. Because KPIs for measuring results are by definition after the fact. They're lagging. And what you want is a set of indicators, which we've regarded as key exception indicators, which are leading indicators of what you need to fix to get a better outcome. In fact, it's what you need to fix to achieve your KPI.
Okay.
So basically, just to summarize, so that is after the fact indicators are good for fixing the process.
Mm-hmm. And is there maybe it's on your website, Dan, but is there an actual best practice guideline for KEIs?
There are best practices. I don't think it's on the website, but if you read the white paper, you get a bit more depth into it, and the methodology we apply takes you through the process of identifying what a KEI, an exception indicator that will work for you, is. Okay.
Is my question to you, rather than ones that's come through from a viewer, why isn't this mainstream?
That's a good question. I think all innovation happens at different stages of a process, and I think if you think of the enormous amount of effort that's gone into shared services to date, a lot of it has been about building the governance model, building the process ownership, building the common standardized systems and processes. And I think now we get to this third wave. I think organizations are realizing they've achieved a lot, but they haven't driven down the cost quite as much as they were expecting. So I think now people are starting to work out why that is. I think it was received wisdom, and it still is a bit, but I think it's breaking down. The received wisdom that we've implemented this big centralized system, it will implement a common process, a standard process, and now people are realizing that isn't so true. So we're at a stage, organizations are starting to adopt this. I think in a year or two, everyone will be saying, oh, this is obvious, we're all doing this now. But it is not, it's definitely not mainstream yet. I think there's probably the top 15% of organizations, perhaps, in this, moving to this third wave of continuous improvement, are looking at this kind of approach.
Okay, good. We're moving into the last couple of minutes of questions. Just an announcement, please, ladies and gentlemen. We have 2 conferences coming up in the next few months for leaders in shared services, one in March in London and one in Chicago. In April, we do run a raffle on our webinars where we issue 2 tickets, 2 VIP tickets to 2 lucky winners. And you are invited to take part in the raffle if you choose. If you would like to be involved, please tick one of the buttons on your screen. So coming back, Dan, question for you. If an organisation with shared services or without shared services, but let's focus on shared services organisations. If a shared service organisation wants to get going running a KEI program rather than a KPI program, what's the next step they should take? How do they proceed with this?
Well, you need to identify, you need to take a process slice that you think is you have a concern about, and given the results on the poll, I guess it's going to be part of procure to pay, accounts payable. You need to engage with some people who know how to go through that process, and take a rapid benchmark to do an analysis for a time slice and perhaps a geographic or regional slice of your business against the exception indicators you agree. We've got a bunch of best practice on those exception indicators that exist in the key financial cycles. So obviously you can talk to us. We can show you how you do that in a 3 or 4 week process to drive through and get your early wins.
Okay, good. Thank you very much indeed. And maybe you can just share with us a couple of companies that you're working with on more of a kind of a KEI program, and maybe companies specifically in shared services or at least the industries that they're working in.
Yeah, we big companies in the tobacco industry, packaging, production of consumer goods, pharmaceuticals. So it's all of the big industrial firms. Yeah.
Okay, good.
The big names. Yep.
Perfect. And finally, Dan, just a little plug for your company, please. We've had a couple of questions come in wanting to know your website address. So maybe you could just share that with us as a final note.
Yeah. It is www.consider.biz, B-I-Z or B-I-Z, if you're from the North American continent.
Wonderful. That's been very insightful. So thank you to Dan for all of his input there. It's been a very educational hour. And ladies and gentlemen, just to alert you to what's coming up next with our webinar program, if you're in Europe, you will know that the SEPA deadline is coming up in February 2014. So you really should attend our 6 must-dos to ensure you have a Get SEPA Ready plan.